We're almost done. I just want to talk about some mode-specific points that I think have a significant impact on how the maps should be designed for those modes that I can't really talk about in the general case. The first thing I want to talk about is Splat Zones. And in Splat Zones, you have the problem of the big zone. The classic example of this was Kelp Dome. Kelp Dome's zone was so big that when you tried to cap it, if you didn't wipe the enemy team, there was probably someone who was spawning in time to contest it before you were able to just, as a team, get the whole thing painted. So you really needed a massive fight win to be able to contest it. There was no way that you were going to be able to get on the zone, paint it for long enough to get the whole thing capped before someone was going to notice and try and splat you. And so you needed to make a very decisive fight win. There was no sneaking the zone. There was no outpainting your opponent for the zone. You really kind of had to fight pretty hard for it. And it made it very snowbally. It made it so that first cap was a lot more likely to win because they were able to just hold it because it took so long for the enemy team to swing it back the other way. So that's a significant zone-specific issue. Now you can have the opposite problem too, where the zone is way too small. And I would argue that Undertow Spillway and Brine Water both have that problem, where all it takes is like one machine throwing fizzy bombs to completely lock down half of Undertow, which makes it so that you cannot hold the zones for a very long time at all. Once you have them, all it takes is like one bomb thrown that way, and now you have to back up and paint it again, and then turn back around, and oh shoot, they shot you in the back while you were trying to recap the zone. So that's not particularly fun either. That also can lead to some pretty degenerate gameplay where it feels impossible to gain any kind of advantage, and it goes back and forth way too quickly. Undertow, I think, is less of a problem because it's more about being able to control whole areas of the map than it is being able to control the zone. But put a zone that size on something like Brine Water, and everybody's looking at it, and it's just a matter of who can bully the other team away from it, because there's no way that you're going to be able to like keep that zone if you're not completely boxing the enemy team out of mid. There's no saving it with paint. A single tri-strike can just recap the entire zone with one tri-strike to spare for the backliner. It takes way too few resources to regain it, and that makes it so that it swings back and forth, and it's very difficult to really establish a hold until you have an extremely decisive fight win. One last thing for zones is that I want to see a balanced ability to hold past the zones while also being able to retake on defense. If you have a situation where the zone's lockout is too powerful, where it's way too easy to keep the zone, then that's really frustrating because, again, it's volatile. First cap wins. But if it's way too easy to retake on defense, it's also frustrating because the game just kind of goes back and forth really easily, and there's not a great way to maintain a good lead, and it comes down to a battle of inches. It feels like you can gain an advantage, but then lose that advantage without having lost map control. Is the kind of thing that can happen there. Tower is a mode which I think really makes a lot of maps shine that normally wouldn't have as much. There were some problematic layouts for Piranha Pit, but I think Tower Control Piranha Pit is one of the best designed map modes in all of Splatoon that I've ever played. Because of this tower path, look at what this does. They could have made this tower path just go straight from your spawn through mid to their spawn, but they decided to make it do this crazy figure eight of a thing, and that makes it so much more tactically interesting. Do you decide to defend the tower when it's at drop and thus try to play the right side of the map? Or do you wait for it to go across mid to the enemy street, where now, at this point in time, you actually have to play the left side of the map? It forces your team to rotate more often. It takes you on a tour of more of the map than you would normally have had to play on another mode. Because this map is very linear on something like Clam Blitz. On Clam Blitz, there's goal here, there's goal here. And so you go across the map, and maybe you play some of this area down here as a distraction, but for the most part, it's just straight line, and you flank around one of these two ramps. But in tower control, going around the right side can be the main way to be going, or it can be a flank, and it all depends on your awareness of where the tower is. It made it so much more tactically complex, and I think that that's a tactical complexity that is missing in a lot of maps in Splatoon 3, or even Splatoon 2 for that matter. Now, Brinewater actually does a really interesting job of this by not necessarily its tower path, but by giving you options to cut corners to get further on the objective line than you can otherwise. And the tower on Museum is also really interesting in this regard, in the way that it kind of has a zigzag in it. So I think that this is something that it doesn't have to be this complex to be good, but it should highlight as much of the map as possible. It should make it so that you have to play different parts of the map so that there's some variety and you're not just standing in the same like 2 defensive locations every single time, that you have to move up and back and right and left depending on where the tower is, and that makes the mode more dynamic, even though it's a relatively slow-moving kind of static objective otherwise. This also should have checkpoints that are difficult. And this goes back to the issue of Scorch Gorge and Flounder that we talked about. If after this checkpoint, you just have a completely free route to the next checkpoint, and there's just no way to defend it at all, those free points I don't think are great. Academy has a very similar problem here, where once the tower clears second checkpoint, getting to the next checkpoint, it's going to snowball real quick. You're going to get to like 20 points after you clear this checkpoint without that much of an opportunity to defend it. And I like maps where if you get up on the tower and there is an advantage state, you're going to be able to clear it a little bit more easily than that. Wahoo World was a little bit of an extreme in the opposite direction, where the checkpoints were too difficult to clear. I think that this isn't a problem in most places. This was more an issue of you're on low ground with no escape route, and you've had to drop all the way down, exposed through the air to get there. This is an extreme example. I think most of the time the problem is that a checkpoint ends up being too easy. I don't see this being an excessive problem for most of the maps in Splatoon 3. I'm trying to think if there are any that I don't like for this reason. I think most of them do have a checkpoint that is difficult enough to clear that you have a really good position to defend from. So I don't think this is a major issue for them right now. But especially, the Flounder and Scorch problem where it snowballs after you clear second checkpoint, that's something that I would like to see addressed. Rainmaker. One of the other silly things about Kelp Dome, we keep coming back to this one because it's such a weird situation from Splatoon map design. There was a really weird shortcut on Rainmaker Kelp Dome, where if you took the Rainmaker, went over Catwalk, you could fire a shot from right about here, and it would paint a line this way. The explosion would land on the other side here. The explosion would paint the side of the goal, but it would also paint enough around the corner that you could fire that one fully charged shot from right here, drop into it, and swim all the way up to KO without having to fire another shot. Now, if a team knew about that, then it wasn't as huge of a problem, but it was a really, really punishing situation if you failed to recognize that they were going right, if you were in solo queue and your teammates didn't know about it. That was not particularly fun. There aren't that many kinds of situations in Splatoon 3. What we see more of is a lack of multiple viable routes. This is something that I'm going to specifically pick on Scorch Gorge for again. Scorch Gorge Rainmaker is really, really annoying because they give you a route that's bad, and then they give you one route that works. The route over the left is ridiculously slow because you have to go over a great bridge. What is it with great bridges on this map? Please stop. And it's very exposed with just about no cover all the way over to the goal. So it looks so tantalizing. And everybody looks at it like, oh, look, it's right there. It's so close. But it actually takes just about the same amount of time to go to the right side. And the whole way you're going around the right side, you've got this wall to hug, and you've got players who can actually push up in front of you without themselves just getting shredded by something. And this is a much safer way to go that's not even that much slower. Similar situation on Inkblot. Inkblot also has this problem in Rainmaker where There is only one way to get to the goal, and it is this way. And you might say, wait, but you can go up to here and use this. This is slower. It's also less safe. So why would you ever go here? If you go up here, then you're vulnerable the entire time you're going from here to here. And going from here to here, moving through the air, climbing up is slow. Whether you had to climb up this wall in Splatoon 2 or whether you get the rail like you do in Splatoon 3, either way, it's going to be slower. If you're trying to go a more conventional way, then you have to go up this ramp, which is unpaintable, and then this other ramp, all of which are putting you at low ground compared to the defenders who also have cover when you don't. So that's not super advantageous either. What's often the much better choice is just to go across the middle of the map here, because you've still got this for cover, and a lot of weapons have short enough range that they're going to have to drop down to be able to reach you, and so now you're on even footing with them. And it's a more direct path to the goal. So not having multiple paths is a definite downside, and it makes me think a little bit less of Inkblot. A good example of how to do it, at least at the bare minimum, is Mako Mart. Mako Mart only has 2 routes, but at least there are 2 of them, and they actually have different use cases. The right side is faster. Going from mid to the right is like 3 seconds faster total, because the other option involves having to climb up this box and jump across there and then do this like right-angled turn to be able to get to the goal. So that's definitely slower, but the advantage of it is that it's much, much safer. When you get from mid up to snipe here, the rest of the way down, you're at high ground for most of the way. The only high ground that you have to worry about is bunker and this area up here. And this area is relatively difficult for the defenders to access compared to bunker. So this is what you have to worry about if you're going fast enough. And if you get bogged down, then you might have to start running into this after that. But if you go to the right side, all of the high ground is accessible immediately from spawn, and it's uncontestable. At least with bunker, a lot of the time you can maybe flank someone around and get them up to the top here and take someone out there. But with spawn, it's literally their spawn. There's nothing you can do about that. It's just going to be there. So the only time that you're really able to push right safely is if you have all of the opponents down and you're also like right around here on stack. So you're able to pop it and go and try and push as fast as you can and try to go for the fast break. And I like that dichotomy of there's a good fast break option versus there's a good safe, slow, and steady option. I think having at least those 2 things makes a Rainmaker map a lot better. Finally, Clam Blitz. Clam Blitz, I think, is a little bit more map design kind of impervious. Like I said before, one of the best modes in Moray Towers was Clam Blitz because of the way that the baskets were situated to make it so that the more problematic parts of the map weren't really that important anymore, because all you had to do was play the baskets themselves. Now, Moray still had the problem that you had to spawn in really slowly, but at least once you got in, the game mode was a lot more manageable than being that big. The basket placement is obviously very important. There were some kind of sticking points with maps like the Reef and Wahoo, where is Wahoo? There it is. Where the basket is up really high, and so you have to get especially close to the basket and look straight up to be able to catch it. And that can be frustrating for newer players who have a hard time actually hitting that basket and getting the score in. At competitive level, this doesn't matter quite as much, but it can definitely make Clam Blitz a little bit frustrating at times. Another thing is where the clams spawn and how they spawn. On Mahi, because this is so small, but because you still need to be able to play a game of Clam Blitz, they just spawn a bunch of clams really close to each other. And that means that it's like never a problem to be able to get clams. There's always going to be clams nearby because they just have so much less space to put the clams on, and they need to put the same number of clams into the game. So I notice when I'm doing things like getting an overhead shot where I have to complete a game of Clam Blitz to be able to see the Clam Blitz map, it's way easier to KO by yourself on Mahi. There are just always clams somewhere. You're never able to really play the clam economy. You're never able to like deny the opponent clams and have that interesting tactical aspect of the game because there's just always going to be clams there. But for the most part, I don't find a lot of problems that Clam Blitz in particular creates. I think decentralizing the objective as much as that game mode does makes it so that you're not going to run into a lot of map design problems that are because of the game mode. They're more going to be just the map itself. So there are my thoughts on stage design. That was obviously a lot longer, but it takes that much talking, I think, to get to the actual principles underlying why we like some stages in competitive play and why we dislike others. Those are my general thoughts on them, and I'm definitely curious to hear what some other competitive players have to say about it. But I think those things give you at least a pretty good idea of where my head is at, and so hopefully you'll understand why when I just say that a map is bad, that the reason I'm not expressing exactly why is that it took me an hour to say it in total the first time. So thank you all for watching, especially those of you who have made it all the way through, and hope you learned a little something about Splatoon for sticking around this long. Have a good one, everyone.